Okay, so here we are for another interview in the History of Hydrology series, and we are at the Institute of Hydrology in Wallingford, as was, now the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And I'm interviewing today John Rodda, formerly at the Institute of Hydrology and later of the Hydrology section at WMO. So he's worked very much in the international hydrology sphere, as well as being involved in the early days of Wallingford. So an interesting question for any hydrologist, John. How did you first get interested in hydrology? How did you get involved with hydrology?
I was in the University of Aberystwyth in the geography department there, and when I had finished my undergraduate studies, I progressed into hydrology through the study of a river basin. My supervisor, Mel Howe, had done some preliminary investigations on the River Dubby, which is quite a large river to the north of Aberystwyth, but it had a very complicated catchment. So he suggested I should look at the River Ystwyth, which is one of the rivers that reaches the sea at Aberystwyth.
It comes back down off the back of Penlimon.
Yeah, and it has a catchment area of 68 square miles, and encompass sort of 3 levels of relief, reaching, I think it was about more than 2,000 feet at the highest point, and of course sea level at the other end. And I suppose I was always very interested in climatology, and I'd studied physics as part of my geography degree, so it led me into looking at the water balance of the River Ystwyth. This is what Mel suggested. So it meant that I had to set up a network of rain gauges, a river flow measurement station, evaporation measurements, and as far as I could to measure the changes in the soil and groundwater in the catchment.
Wow.
So this was a project that faced me as a PhD student, and I was very fortunate that there were a number of stations already existing in the area where there were full-blown climatological stations from which I could estimate evaporation. There were 6 of those, I think, within 3 within the basin and another 3 close to outside. And there were also several rain gauges associated with them, but no river gauging station. So my first task was to set up a network of rain gauges, and the department had a few, and I borrowed some from the Met Office, and eventually had a network of 30 rain gauges extending inland from Aberystwyth up to the, well, not the highest point, because there wasn't anybody there to take observations. But I managed to persuade lots of locals to read these rain gauges for me.
On a daily basis?
On a daily basis, yes. And couple those with the rain gauges in the existing climatological station. Right in the middle of the catchment, there was a Ministry of Agriculture research station, Trowscoed, where there was lots of data. So I did that, and one of the essential things that I bought a Lambretta scooter because I had to get round all these people, not only to get them to set up the rain gauges, but to collect the data. So I used to go around on my scooter once a month and pick up all the data. But I then had to set up a river gauging station, and I did this on the lowest point that I could get to on the River Ystwyth, where there was a bridge, and I made a stat gauge on the wall and marks on the bridge so that I could see how it related to the depth of water. And then fortunately, Mel Howe managed to borrow a current meter from Cambridge University, where he had some friends, and so this current meter came, and I used that initially. And then he bought one out of departmental funds, so I used to go out with the assistance of other students on my scooter and dangle the current meter over the bridge and measure the flow, and so and then daily and more frequently look at the level, and then I related the levels to the discharge through the stage discharge curve and so on. So I did this, and then I tried to measure soil moisture and groundwater, but the catchment was floored by lower Paleozoic rocks, and it was all very watertight, and there didn't seem to be very much in the way of changes in anything that I measured. So that was a sort of minor element. So between the rainfall and the evaporation and the river flow, I was able to make a water balance of the catchment, which I had two very contrasting years actually. 1958 was the first year, and it was quite wet, and the 1959 was quite dry. So I had lots of data, and I achieved a water balance. And it was the first time, I believe, since John Dalton
in the northwest
did this in 1802 for the whole of the UK. Nobody bothered to work out a water balance for a catchment, although lots of measurements had been taken otherwise. Now, very fortunately, in the middle of all this, I had a visit from a guy in the Met Office who had loaned us the rain gauges, and he brought with him Eamon Nash.
Ah, right.
And Eamon Nash came to see me and was impressed by what I'd done. And he said, "Oh, you must come and work at hydraulics research." So when I came to the end of my PhD, he said, "Oh, well, you should apply for a junior research fellowship at HR Wallingford," which I did, and I was successful in getting it.
Right, okay.
And
so this is actually just before the hydrological research unit was set.
Oh yeah. Well before. At Wallingford in IAHS, as it was then, there was Eamon Nash leading the hydrology section, and he'd been there for. This was, perhaps I should say that I started in Wallingford in 1960. So before that, I think Eamon had come as a senior research fellow in about 1957, and he then published two inceptive papers.
Really important papers.
Very important papers, which established him and HR Wallingford as a place
Centre of hydrological research. Yes.
But why he wanted me to come was because he wanted to set up a similar setup to what I'd been doing in Aberystwyth. And he'd identified the Grendon Underwood catchment on the head of the River Ray as being the one where he wanted to get detailed measurements and then use those in flood prediction or flow prediction. So immediately I was launched into setting up instruments in Grendon Underwood. It was on the River Ray, which is a tributary of the Thames. And fortunately, Thames Conservancy built a very nice river gauge there. And I set up a network of rain gauges, established a climate station, which was in the grounds of the Grendon Underwood prison, and got a lot of observers to do the readings. And so I managed to do all that with Eamon supervising. Then Eamon got offered a job in Nigeria, and he went off to work for the inland, I think it was the Inland Waters Department in Lokoja. So I was left by myself, but with a number of people, experimental officer assistants in the in HR, and then John Sutcliffe appeared, and John had become involved in a committee on hydrological research, which had been set up by the government to investigate really the results of Frank Law's experiments on Stocks Reservoir.
Yes. The forest used more water than grass.
Yeah, Frank Law had shown that the water companies shouldn't afforest their catchment areas because a lot of the water that would have run into the reservoirs was evaporating because of the forest. And there was big controversy over this. Penman said, well, no, it couldn't happen because where was the extra energy coming from? And anyway, Frank Law got this stand of Sitka spruce, and he was measuring the rainfall over it and under it, and it was a lysimeter that he got, but his results showed that there was something like a third of the rain being lost. And he worked out what it was in terms of the cost to the Fylde Water Board, and it was quite a lot of money. So this committee, chaired by, I'm not sure Penman was the chairman, but he was one of the influential members, started to deliberate on this problem. And they decided they wanted to set up an experiment. And so where was to be the focus of this study? And there was a lot of argument amongst the members of this committee, which had lots of different government departments represented. There must have been 12 or 15 government departments, Forestry Commission, Nature Conservancy.
That's not a good way to get a group.
No, Met Office was there and so on. Anyway, they decided that the body to carry out this study should be at Wallingford, and Eamon would be the head of it. And in the meantime, he came back from Nigeria, having been out there, I think it was 15, 18 months, something like that.
Okay.
This was 1962, 63, around about that time. So, having established that Eamon would lead this
Hydrological Research Unit.
They decided it should be called the Hydrological Research Unit. And so the Hydrological Research Unit was formed under, as sort of an adjunct to HRS.
And it was still on the Howbury Park site when I visited in 71. Something
and
like that.
a new building should be put up, which had a soils laboratory in it, which was particularly important. I can remember going to the building research establishment on the day when the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its climax. And then, as the other part, it was necessary to try and find out where to carry out this study. The idea was to have a paired catchment study, where you would either plant trees on, if two catchments were the same in sort of low vegetation, or maybe one would be in forest of some sort. So John Sutcliffe and I initially went around the country in a chauffeur-driven HR car, because you weren't allowed to drive official cars at the time. And we went up to Scotland, and the idea was to try and find a pair of catchments in the part of the UK where there was an evaporative need for sort of 5 years out of 10, not in the high rainfall areas and not in the low rainfall areas, but in the area between. So we searched between the sort of southern uplands of Scotland, down the sort of edge of the Pennines, Cotswolds, and then into Exmoor. And we eventually found that there must have been about 5 or 6 catchments eventually. John and I identified these, and then Eamon and I, plus members of this committee, went around many of them,
the short list,
to choose which was the best. And the one that we eventually chose was in Shropshire, on the mountain called the Long Mynd. And the Long Mynd again was Paleozoic. Watertight catchments, 3 southeast-facing catchments, beautifully situated. They were identical in terms of size. One was in short vegetation, the next one was in planted forestry, and I can't remember what the third one was. So that was where we wanted to set up the experiment. And so we entered, it was the Nature Conservancy were involved at this stage, and they entered into negotiations with the landowners. Now, the unfortunate part was, although the Forestry Commission owned the forest area, the other one was common land. And common land is something difficult in terms of ownership. So I went to a meeting in Church Stretton, which is right next to the Long Mynd, of the commoners, and tried to persuade them that we weren't going to do anything bad. We wanted to set up these instruments and work on the two basins and get an answer in terms of the effect of the forest. But they wouldn't agree. Next catchments, I think, were in the Quantock Hills adjoining Exmoor, and they weren't, although they were, there was a pair there that wasn't anything like as good as the Longmynd. So we were in a dilemma, and by a strange coincidence, a chap called Olaf Slaymaker,
All right, yes.
who was in the Department of Geography at Aberystwyth, said, "Why don't you do something on Plinlimmon?" And I remember him coming to Wallingford, and then we went up to look at Plinlimmon, which I of course I'd known before. So we went up there. Several people from the hierarchy of DSIR and Director of Hydraulics Research and so on, and we went up and had a look, and there was the Severn catchment, about 8 square miles of nearly all forest, and adjacent to it the River Wye, which was upland sheep pasture. The only thing was, of course, that it was in a high rainfall area. So the question was, would you ever be able to decipher the difference because of the wetness of the place? And Penman was very sceptical and sort of doubted it. But despite this, it was decided to go ahead. So
at least there was something.
So off we went. We embarked on this Plinlimmon project, and of course we had to set up the infrastructure there first of all. The forest area had roads, but not entirely satisfactory to where we wanted to go. The other one had one track up the middle, and there was no way getting across the watershed between the two. So we had the Forestry Commission built a number of roads. The Wye River Authority built gauges in both catchments, and on the mainstream, and then on the turbulent flowing tributaries, there were 3 for each basin. We put in a new steep stream structure that Hydraulics Research had invented. So that was all preparatory work, and an office was set up, and then the rain gauge network started, and we devised a system for the network, which was based on topographic units, on the basis that if you had a unit of the countryside, which was the same in terms of altitude, aspect, and so on, you were likely to get the same rainfall over that area. So we
sampled those.
We did that in the where it was open, and in the forest catchment we set up rain gauges on poles. Perhaps I should go back a little bit, because before this, Frank Law, when I went to see him, had a ground level rain gauge in operation, and he explained to me that although the standard Met Office gauges caught so much, he found that the percentage at ground level was greater. So which was the true
in windy locations like this?
Which was the true
rainfall
amount. So here.
Here at Wallingford.
In Wallingford.
Just at the back of the park.
At the climate site that I'd set up before, we set up a rain gauge experiment with a standard rain gauge, and then 3 or 4 different types of gauges set at ground level within sort of the things like you protect strip lights with all made out of metal. So they tried to recreate the art at the surface of grass, but to avoid the splash. So we set up this, and it was run for this experiment was run. Well, it was running continuously, and to make sure that we got the measurements as near to as truth as possible, every morning each rain gauge bottle was taken into the laboratory and weighed, rather than
actually tipping it out.
Rather than the usual volume assessment. So that had been going on for some time, and in addition to that, we experimented with ring gauges which were had a very narrow support and a funnel at the top. And of course, in the case of the gauges at ground level, we found that all of these caught more rain than the standard rain gauge. It amounted to something like 6% on an annual basis. And the nearest to the ground level gauge in terms of an elevated gauge was this funnel gauge. It's a funny, odd looking thing. Anyway, so at Plinlimmon we put in ground level rain gauges everywhere that we could, and then mounted these gauges on poles in the forest to catch the rainfall at the top of the canopy. Now this took, setting up everything took, 2, 3, 4 years.
Would have started around 64, 65?
The Plinlimmons, I think we started, we got permission from the landowner, because there had to be an agreement, legal agreement arranged with the landowner and the Forestry Commission. 1st of January 1967 we started.
67. I know the data started coming.
My eldest son had been born 2 days before, the one who's now an MP.
Right.
So it took quite a time to set up all this instrumentation, and it wasn't until the early 1970s that it started. There must have been about half a dozen staff there to start with, because it was pretty arduous going around all these gauges, and particularly in the winter time. Snow was a problem, but fortunately there wasn't many occasions when there was snow to get over the measurement problem with the snow. 1972 came, and I, with Jim McCulloch, went to a meeting in Geneva of the Commission for Hydrology, probably a year or so before that. And I got interested when I was there in what the hydrology department was doing in WMO. There was internationally, there was Jerry Nemetz was the leader, a Czech, very interesting Czech gentleman who could speak 15 languages.
Which is useful in WMO.
So I said to Jerry, I'd quite like to come and work with you for some time. And Jim McCulloch was very supportive and said, yes, go off to Geneva. One of the things that affected this was the fact that the Secretary General of WMO at the time was a Welshman. And at a reception I said Burradar to him. that sort of made
the difference.
So 1972 I went to work for a year on secondment in WMO in Geneva.
And had you, you also involved in IAHS?
Yes, I've forgotten that.
You were on the precipitation subgroup.
The results of these experiments with ring gauges was the paper that I presented to the Bern Scientific Assembly, or General Assembly, IUGG, and as a result of that I was made the president of the Precipitation Committee, which was one of the sort of minor things. It sounded good, but anyway, I was sort of an officer of IAHS at that
already.
time.
So you had some international connections already.
So
so we were just starting at WMO.
I'm just trying to remember whether I went to Moscow. Moscow General Assembly was in 1971. And I went to that. And at that time there were elections for officers in IAHS. And George Kovacs, a Hungarian, and Jean Rodda, a Frenchman, vied for being Secretary General. In the end, it was Kovacs who won, and Rodda became the president and Kovacs the secretary general. And there was a new constitution formulated, and there was the position of editor created. And so both of them asked me if I would be the editor. So with agreement from Jim McCulloch, who was very supportive, I was able to say yes.
Right.
So
so that was 71. And
I had this year in WMO, and I came back and was head of the section concerned with water balance, still Plinlimmon, but I was also editing the Hydrological Sciences Journal, and I altered that to try and make it more scientific, because TSON before sort of had a lot of chat in it, and it wasn't entirely scientific. And in addition to
sort of transactions and news as well as
in addition to that, it was distributed free to members of IAHS, member countries that was. So it had a rather limited circulation. But I think with Kovacs's agreement, changed it to be a paid journal. So we got this paid journal going, and Jim very kindly recruited somebody to be the editor, the assistant editor to me, as it were, a lady called Penny Kisby, and she became a member of staff of the
and stayed for a long
Institute
time.
of Hydrology, as it did become from the Hydrological Research Unit. So she took up the editing on a sort of daily basis, and as an editor does, approve papers and all that sort of thing, wrote editorial. So I was doing that alongside working here. But then UK government decided to change the basis for scientific research, and this was on on the results of a survey that had been done by a guy called Lord Rothschild.
Right. Yes.
And Rothschild produced a report which said basically that the government should be supporting research which promotes its policies or supports its policies. So any research that wasn't doing that, they didn't want. They just wanted. So all the government research bodies then were subjected to investigations, and several departments were nominated as the places who would be the customers for research, and the Department of Environment was one of these, which seemed to be closest to NERC and the various establishments in NERC. So lo and behold, there was a job advertised in London for instigating the Rothschild procedure within the Department of the Environment. And I applied for this job, and I got it, much to my surprise. So there I was, promoted from what I was here to a position in Whitehall. And
but there was some discussion about whether the Institute should join the Department of the Environment at that
time. There was all sorts of strange manipulations at the time. Because NERC had been created in 1965, I did mention that, and that's when the Hydrological Research Unit was hived off from HR Wallingford, which went into something called the Ministry of Technology, along with the Building Research Establishment and Transport and Road Research Laboratory. So HRU moved into the Natural Environment Research Council, which was created in 1965, along with a number of other green bodies around the country, like the Nature Conservancy and National Institute of Oceanography and so on. So I got this job in London, which worked in the research, just trying to remember what it's called, it was the research department within DOE. and I was a member of that, working to a Director General called Joe Lyons. So one of my first jobs there was to go around the various NERC establishments with others to evaluate how valuable what they were doing was to do DOE. And this took up quite a long time, because there were, must have been 20 different establishments where
lots of different
things were going on which might be of interest. So having done all this, we then presented this to DOE, and then DOE had to agree to fund these bits of research, which the money for which had been taken away from NERC. I mean, it was a very strange process, and there were peculiarities in this, because although from the science point of view, many of us could see the value of the research to DOE, the so-called customers in DOE, the sort of political departments, couldn't see what the value was. So they were a most strange situation.
Didn't really know what they wanted either.
They didn't know what they wanted. So it doesn't, from the Rothschild point of view, it didn't seem to make sense at all. But anyway, this went ahead. The Rothschild was implemented, and NERC lost quite a lot of its money, I think, which went into DOE, and DOE sort of machined it and through the process. And anyway, I was there for a couple of years in Whitehall, and I found out how government works and how. And then there were several reorganizations in 1974. One was of local government, and the other one was the water industry. And the Conservative government, strangely, from how you view it now, sort of nationalised the water industry. So all of the water companies and the sewage treatment authorities were all merged into regional water authorities. And there was the Thames region, the Severn Trent created, and so on. So this was a complete change. Lots of people objected to it because of the link between a town and its water supply. But it happened. And one of the results of this was that a body in Reading called the Water Resources Board was split into two and sort of demoted. Again, there was an interesting aside, because WRB had alienated the department in the Department of the Environment, the part of the department, the Inspectorate General of Water Engineering, and they became rivals over a period of time. So the Inspectorate General did its best to downgrade the Water Resources Board, which it did, because the board was split into two, and there was the Central Water Planning Unit created, and the Water Data Unit. And there was a job in the Water Data Unit, which I went into, and we acted to improve data collection and its analysis across the regional water authorities, and collaborated with bodies in Scotland, Northern Ireland, not with Wales at the time, because Wales was part of the reorganisation.
That's still based down in Reading.
A big one?
But that's still based in Reading. The
unit. Planning unit remained in Reading, and the data unit remained in Reading, or was in Reading. So it was very strange. We had a chap called David Newsom as the director, who'd been part in WRB, and I occupied one of the positions below him, and my cousin David Rodda occupied the other one. And my job was on the data collection side and publicity, public relations, that sort of thing. David was looked after the analysis, and there was one of the first mainframe computers in water engineering being used by the Water Data Unit. And I remember being so impressed by all the magnetic tapes that were in the tape library, and this machine that could...
We have a job to read one now. But,
and I mean, a camera has got, I don't know, 100 times the power that we had. I got a figure 286 kilobytes or something like that. I mean, maybe
on the mainframe.
Anyway,
that's possible.
So I spent some time then in the water data unit, but I still edited the IAHS journal, and
still the bulletin at that time.
And I continued to be involved internationally because under David Newsom, I became there was a position called the hydrological advisor to the UK permanent representative to WMO.
Right.
And I became the hydrological advisor to the Met Office through the planning unit. So I went to several meetings in WMO, and I also went to several meetings in UNESCO, because as you know, there's a WMO operational hydrology program, and there's in UNESCO, it's education and training and research that is the main focus of the International Hydrological Program. And so I sort of kept up links with both these bodies, and through them and through IAHS over the period when I was in the water data unit. Now the water data unit sort of did itself out of business in a way, because gradually each of the regional water authorities got more competent, and they set up their own computing systems. And what was the point of having things
send all that data off centrally?
So the only reason for the water data unit eventually, well, apart from the fact that we promoted several areas of research and changed them into operation, the river gauging by ultrasonic and acoustic methods and electromagnetic sewer and flow measurements were all something
at that time.
So we did all that, but by 1982 the water data unit was disbanded. But the bit that was the most important in terms of my area of endeavour was the collection of river flow data, and that was transferred to Wallingford. So I came back to Wallingford in 1982 with a group of people. So there was I think there were about 6 or 7 of us who came back to Wallingford to run the river flow archive and to be involved in the publication of data and its collection from the different authorities. And it was a really sensible thing, because Northern Ireland, Scotland were also involved with England and Wales, and it couldn't have been done very easily otherwise. NERC covering all parts of the UK. So I came back to Wallingford and came back to head a group of people involved in, I forgot what it was called now, sort of data collection, assimilation, and so on. And I still found that I had Plynlimmon under my control. So I got back up to Plynlimmon, and it was the time when there'd been quite a lot of data collected, and it became obvious that there was this difference between the forestry and the other basin, and
some problems with the early data.
Yeah, there were all.
And the flood that had an impact.
It sounds easy now, but there were always data collection problems. The instruments not measuring the thing that you wanted them to measure, or they went out of order, or something untoward happened.
And very early digital recorders.
The climate there is being tough, humid, windy, all that sort of thing, is against measurements that are of interest to hydrologists. But nevertheless, there was quite a lot of data collected, and there was an analysis done which showed that there's more than 20% less runoff from the forest catchment than the other catchment. But then, why was the question? Why was the difference? And when I came back, this was starting to be answered. And Jim Shuttleworth and some of the people working for him had installed a forest lysimeter and were measuring evaporation from the forest canopy and so on. And this was going on, but then there's several other problems arose which seemed to be able to be answered by Plindeman. Acid rain was one of them, and there were water quality problems sort of being added to the perspective in Plindeman, and it became more and more obvious that it was a very valuable place which to operate. So the Plindeman experiment was continuing. So this was the 1980s, but shortly before that, while I was still in the Water Data Unit, I went to the IAHS Assembly in Canberra and got appointed the Secretary General. David Newsom, unfortunately, was very much against that, and I had a lot of problems from him trying to be the Secretary General at Reading. Of course, when I came back here, Jim was very supportive, and I didn't matter at all. And so as Secretary General, I got very much involved in various meetings. Oh, we had a very interesting flood symposium in Oxford, not long ago. And that was something very exceptional, I thought, scientifically, with some very good papers. But there was a scientific assembly within IUGG in 1983, but before that we had the first IAHS Scientific Assembly in Exeter University, which attracted about 600 or more hydrologists from around the world. Lots of publications, interest, and it was a very good meeting. So that was you know, a landmark in a way. So that 1983, the Scientific Assembly, no, the General Assembly in IUGG, I was re-elected as Secretary General, and Rodda, I think, stood down, and George Kovacs became the president. And George was president from 1983 to 1987, but he had bad health, and when it came to 1987 and the IAHS assembly in Vancouver, I was having to do the job of President and Secretary General, and it wasn't very easy at all. And then I got a telephone call from Professor Obasi, Secretary General of WMO, saying he'd like to appoint me as the Director of the Hydrology and Water Resources in succession to Professor Jerry Nemitz. Would I accept the position? So I said I'd have to think about it over a little bit. Jerry Nemitz came to see me here to persuade me to, and there was, from my point of view, it was a great move. But Annabelle, as a teacher, had been promoted several years before into a prestigious position and did good girls' school, and it sounded as if she was going to move up to the next level and become even more important as deputy head or something like that. So what the hell are we going to do? And then of course we found out that wives in Geneva weren't allowed to work. The Swiss government wouldn't allow them unless they got there's a special dispensation. You could only work in a voluntary capacity. So this was anyway. I was very lucky that Annabelle said she would not stop my becoming the director of the Hydrology and Water Resources Department. So in January 1988, off we went to Geneva. We lived in a little house in one of the villages outside Geneva, and entered into WMO with the Hydrology and Water Resources Department. And it was very exciting.
Yes, I'm sure.
And I got on very well with Professor Obasi. I struck a good sort of chord with him.
That's quite important.
And the deputy secretary at the time was a guy called Jim Bruce, a Canadian. And he was, well, it was Bruce and Clark is one of the original hydrology textbooks.
Yes.
And he was very supportive as well. So I found there was a sort of open door almost for I could do what I wanted. And I had a very good set of people working for me. Members of other departments used to come and say, "You've got the best department in WMO." And they were all very enthusiastic, and I trusted them completely. John Miller, who used to be here at one time, was one of them.
John, yes.
He was there as a New Zealander. And there was another guy called Arthur Askew, who was there as an Australian. And I had people from Guyana, in India, where else? Norway, and several other places working for me. So off I sat as director of hydrology
for
and water
about
resources.
10 years.
And I was there. I retired in 1995. So
88 to
yeah, so in total I got 8 years service in WMO. How can I say it? I found working in NERC and in the Department of the Environment, there were rules, and they were all formulated in something called ESTA code. I don't know whether you ever saw it, but it's a handbook for how
All the civil service.
civil servants are supposed to operate. I never looked at it. And I never met anybody who ever did. But WMO was rather different. It had rules, and you had to be rather careful that you didn't transcend these rules. And I can understand it completely, because I mean, the philosophy,
level,
the philosophy of the people there were entirely
potential for corruption.
so lots of different things. So it was a great change in that respect. But the work was very exciting. We were promoting hydrology, operational hydrology around the world in the WMO 180 or so member countries. So one of the first things I did was to go to the United States. Although I knew the people there before, I had to sort of acquaint myself with how they were operating and feeling and so on. Max Kohler retired by then, but he very kindly sort of shepherded me around, and I can't remember whether Annabelle came with me at that time. Probably not. Anyway, I was there for a week or so, and then people in my department said, "Oh, if you went to the United States, you ought to go to the Soviet Union as well." So I set up with a visit to the Soviet Union, and Annabelle came with me to that. And so there I was in Moscow with the hydrologists in Moscow, and they took me to the Institute of Geography and various other scientific establishments. Very, very happy that I was there. And then went to Leningrad overnight by train, and there was Shiklemanov waiting for me with a great big bunch of flowers for my wife and almost a red carpet, and put us up in a nice hotel, and they couldn't have been more supportive. Pleasant, marvelous time looking around.
There's a long history of
Leningrad
Soviet hydrology.
There's
some classic work, but not all that well known.
Anyway, so I got familiar with how they were feeling, and went back to Geneva feeling, I was
in balance.
And then there were, of course, all the time in WMO there were meetings of one sort or another going on. So I got involved with, the Commission for Hydrology. WMO has this system where there are 8 commissions, at least at the present time. There's a talk of disbanding them all now. So the Commission for Hydrology is one of them, and that had started in a meeting in Washington in 1971. Alongside us, there was, of course, the International Hydrological Program of UNESCO, and one of the people I had to liaise with was Sorin Dimitrescu, who was the director of the Water Sciences Division in UNESCO. So between UNESCO and WMO, there were a number of different meetings involving us and them, and the Commission for Hydrology, and the Executive Committee of WMO itself, which brought together every year elected representatives of world meteorology, and then once every 4 years the Congress. And for the Commission, for the Committee, for the Congress, it was required to report on your activities, and so I and my colleagues would do that to enlighten what was going on. And within the Commission, of course, the program that we instituted resulted from discussions in the Commission, which were then agreed by the Committee and the Congress. So we went forward in sort of 2 4-year periods into the future, working towards the WMO long-term plan which existed.
Was that a period when operational hydrology in terms of measurements was still being encouraged and was expanding?
Oh, yes. When you say, I think we've done several surveys, or WMO have done several surveys of the state of instrumentation around the world.
Yeah.
And earlier ones in the 1970s showed, let's say 100% operations. Yeah. But by the time we were in the 1980s, it was 90% operating, right. Yeah. And it gradually got worse.
Yes. So that's been a concern.
So one of the things there were 2 things sort of outside the department in a way. The International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction started in 1990, and I became the scientific member of the IDNDR committee for WMO.
Right.
So I went to that a number of times, and that was very interesting, and helping to get ideas from that into WMO and our program and the programs of other members, other departments. One of the important meetings was the mid-decade conference, which took place in Yokohama in 1994, I think it was. Anyway, so the IDNDR was going on, and that was something I was very much involved with. But in addition, then up came the meeting in Rio de Janeiro, which formulated the blueprint for the future, Agenda 21. And there were a number of preparatory meetings for this, and in them, water played an important part. And it so happened that because of rotation, I became the chairman of the UN Committee on Water, with representatives from about 20-odd UN agencies, FAO, World Bank, and all the lot. I was the chairman of this committee, and it met every year, different places, and then the idea came that the UN Committee on Water should sponsor a meeting, organize a meeting on water as an input to the Rio process. There were a number of preparatory conferences for Rio, several in Geneva, but we had this one separate, and it took place in Dublin in January 1992, and the Dublin principles were enunciated. One about women was particularly important. So this went into the report in Rio, and was assimilated into the result that came out of that, the Agenda 21. So that was a sort of...
There must have been some satisfaction in seeing some of these things too.
Well, the Dublin conference...
Being able to have some sort of impact at that sort
Dublin conference, of course, was chaired by Jim Bruce. And Jim Doog. And he
which
played
is always a good start.
Yeah, he plays a very important part. Yeah. So, but I mean, Jim played a pivotal role with that. After that in WMO, I mean, life went on with lots of commission meetings. And one of the things that I remember most vividly, actually, we put in, as WMO, money into a course in Nairobi, a hydrology course for training hydrologists in Africa. And I don't think we put in a lot of money, but it was sufficient to get the thing going. And it was a course running for 9 months or so, with people from, I think, a large number of countries. There must have been, probably 40 or so people on this course. I went to the graduation ceremony in Nairobi, 1994 it must have been, something like that. And I was amazed how grateful all these people were, and grateful to me, really. And I'd only played a small part in it, but it was the sort of pinnacle of my feelings about hydrology and water and education and training. It was really great. And
definitely counts as a big success.
Pleased to shake hands with all these guys, and no, I don't know what's happened to them since, but I hope they were influential in their own countries.
Absolutely.
So that in one way was I felt a tremendous achievement.
So you sort of retired from WMO?
I retired from WMO.
So what happened after that?
Well, when I came back, I wondered what I would be doing, but then things sort of happened rapidly, because I became
that post-retirement.
I became president of IAHS. That was 1997, so I had a slight gap, and I was elected in Morocco, with Gordon Young as the Secretary General and Uri Shamir as the past president. The Morocco General Assembly, or Scientific Assembly, was quite a successful one, except there wasn't any alcohol for the dinner. Hydrologists. We thought Moroccans might have allowed it, but they didn't. Anyway, the dinner was marvellous, and despite that, the food and the ambience and the Scientific Assembly, I thought was a good success. So I started off as president and went to Boulder as for the IAHS, and we started off the PUD initiative there, with Enda O'Connell particularly. So that became part of IAHS.
There's been some editing. You've done quite a lot of edited books as well.
Oh yeah. One of the things that I did not long after I retired was Andras asked me to edit a Russian book. Shiklemanov and his colleagues had produced this World Water Sources book, which was about 1,000 pages in Russian English, or English Russian, and obviously it wasn't going to make an impact.
A good read.
As it was. So Andras said, would I edit this?
That's quite a job.
And it took me a hell of a, it must have taken 2 years to do this, because although I could understand the Russian, to put it into English that was more sort of English than was a terrible job. Fortunately, I had my Harvey and his wife helped me with that, and I had quite a nice feed from UNESCO. And then it came out, and I didn't ask this at all, but Andras put on the cover that it was edited by Shiklemanov and Rodda, and I hadn't asked or hadn't advocated that my name appeared there, so I was very grateful. Alongside that, there's a charitable trust based in London called WHAT, W-H-A-T, and I can't remember what it stood for now. But WHAT decided that there were 3 areas of endeavour where there were pinch points for the future civilization. One was crop production, one was water, and I can't remember what the third was. It might have been marine life, something like that. And this charitable trust, had money to sponsor meetings. And the guy who had previously been the Secretary General, was it just the Secretary General? Royal Society Secretary General, a geologist whose name I've forgotten now. He was the Secretary of Watt. So he asked me if I would chair the meetings of Watt on water. And he said there's 2 years to produce this report, which we want you to identify where the difficulties were. And you've got to set up a group. So I chose a number of people from around the world to work on this problem. People I knew and people I didn't know so well. And we had a series of meetings. We started off in Oxford. We went to San Francisco. We went to Kuala Lumpur. Where else did we go? Oh, we went to Seville and somewhere else, but I've forgotten. So we had this series of meetings where each of the members of the committee made an input, and there was a lady, I don't know, she may have been known to you, and what's her name? I'll remember in a minute. Anyway, she lives not far from you now, in the place where the racetrack is. Cartmel, that's right, she lives in Cartmel.
Okay.
Anyway, she was the secretary of this committee and recorded all our deliberations. So there was a nice report produced, and it was presented to the trustees of Watt, and I don't know what happened to it after that.
Yes.
Anyway, that took me quite a time over this period. Then Andras got me involved in various other things with UNESCO. I had to evaluate IHP 5, and again I had to set up a committee with people. There was a South African, there was a guy from the United States, there was Chinese, there were 4 or 5 of us who met a number of times to evaluate IHP 5. So I did that for UNESCO and Andras, and then several other things that Andras asked me to do, editing and proposing things, and so I was kept quite busy by UNESCO, not by WMO. I had hardly anything from WMO.
So what? I mean, you've had some successes at that international level in terms of various projects and programs and so on and so forth. But we also talked about the fact that instrumentation sites are going down and so on. What's your assessment of the current state of international cooperation for water?
In terms of cooperation generally, I don't think it's very good. It needs to be much more disciplined. There was an editorial in the Observer on Sunday. I don't know whether you noticed it.
No.
Well, it started off by talking about the present situation here, but then it went on to talk about the situation generally around the world, and the fact that many large urban centres are running out of water, or like Cape Town.
Cape Town recently is a prime example, yes.
I was talking to somebody from Nairobi on Sunday, and apparently there's a lot of water shortages in Nairobi at the present time, and most places are in the same straits. That's the water supply part. And then if you look at sewage and sewage treatment, most of the big cities in the developing world don't treat their sewage at all. Lots of pollution problems resulting. The whole situation needs something akin, and I've advocated this for ages, an intergovernmental, IPCC has been looking at climate.
Yes.
There needs to be one on water, and to try and harden up and make more disciplined approaches to the water problems of the world within a whole range of countries, and institute better collaboration and cooperation across national frontiers and exchange of information
across national frontiers and exchange of data and so on and so forth. Yes. So we need to do better.
A lot better.
Perhaps the message we should end up with. Yeah.
So if there's a future for hydrology water resources, it's getting the instrumentation that starts to provide you the realistic answers.
Yes. As a modeler, I would agree with you wholeheartedly. So, thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon. And,
Exposure.
so, thanks a lot.